And 3, 2, 1. We are live, I think, maybe. One thing says it's live and one thing says it's not. Okay, now both of them say we're live. Great. All right. Welcome everybody to another episode of Sambhashana. I'm Ishita Kent.
And I'm Kiran Bhat.
And we are so excited that you're joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. We are so excited to have two incredible writers with us. How many times did I just say excited in the past 5 seconds?
It's especially excited. So.
I'm just really excited for this, guys. So, Andre, Vikram, I'm going to have Andre introduce yourself first, and then Vikram go right after that.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Andre Bagoo. I'm a poet and writer from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm really happy to be here to be part of this conversation.
And we're happy to have you as well.
Yes, very happy.
Vikram, can you go?
Yeah.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Okay, so my name is Vikram, Vikram Kolmannskog, surname that hardly anybody manages to write correctly, but I think you actually did, if you did write my surname. Yeah, I'm dual heritage, Norwegian, Indian, live and based in Oslo, Norway, together with a partner. I'm a poet, writer. I'm a professor of Gestalt psychotherapy. I have a small private practice. I think those are my main occupations at the moment, yes.
And we are also very happy to have you. I think I would also love to have a side conversation with you about Gestalt therapy, which I've had conversations with two other writers. Maybe that can then become another panel for another space. But anyways.
Yeah.
So can you? Yeah, you go first. You should
go ahead.
Yeah. No, you go. Yeah.
I was going to ask, we do know a little bit about Trinidadian and Indian heritage. Andre, why don't you just give us like a quick primer on how the Indian diaspora community works in Trinidad and Tobago?
Yeah, so a brief history of Trinidad and Tobago. It was, well, first of all, it's located just off Venezuela, the South American continent, in case people don't know where it actually is. It was settled first by the Spaniards, rediscovered by Christopher Columbus, and it was a Spanish colony for many years, and then it became a British colony. And in this process of colonization, slaves were brought to Trinidad, and then later indentured laborers from India, as well as elsewhere. And then at various points, there's also been migration to Trinidad from Europe, in particular, in efforts to kind of bolster the colony then, as it was. So that's how Trinidad has ended up being this very multicultural melting pot of so many different races. So my mom's family is East Indian. My dad's family is Black or Afro-Trinidadian. And that's that's not unusual here. We have a very large mixed race population, but primarily the two largest ethnic components of the population are Black and East Indian people. And that has resulted in some very interesting dynamics over the years, which I get into in my essay collection, The Undiscovered Country, but that's like a whole thesis. So that's basically it.
That's where you say read the book, right?
Read the book, yeah.
Here and like
Savannah, imagine the book right here.
I have the book.
Yes,
I really like the cover.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, it's very it's kind of it's meant to be. It's actually fitting for this discussion because it's meant to be very malleable or unstable. It's not quite an animal print. It's not quite a geographic contour.
It's like a zebra, and that also is certain.
Yeah,
we talk about like the mixes of colors and then like
The blurring of boundaries.
yes, yes. What about you, Vikram? Can you tell us a little bit about how the Indian conversation is in Norway?
I might be able to tell you a tiny little bit, because well, there is not a very big Indian diaspora in Norway. I think mostly like the South Asian diaspora is of Pakistani origin here. There's a smaller, and there is like a Punjabi community in Norway as well. Apart from that, the Indian community is quite small. So, but there are some Indians, like I think there are all over the world. Yeah, and I think I don't know if I've already told you, Andre, but my ex-husband he's Black British, and his mother was from Trinidad.
Oh wow,
And I remember, yeah, and I remember like some words, like she would say "jira," for example.
Yeah.
I think cumin, right?
Yeah,
Jira
definitely.
is the South Asian thing. Like people say jira all the time to refer to Cuban.
Yeah,
I use Jira pork. I use Jira all the time. Yeah.
yeah.
I like it in my soda, but that's another topic.
What?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a thing in India, Jira soda. It's very
I mean, that's amazing because food is such a rich kind of repository of all of the cultures, and that's
Really?
certainly the case here in Trinidad, where we have something called doubles, which talks back to East Indian connections, and of course we have roti, and we have like a whole East Indian food section, and then we have Chinese, and we have like Creole food, and then it's all mixed.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. It's so clear the interconnection when we look at food, right? Like, Indians will think that like chilies and tomatoes and all of that like is so Indian, and then it's really from South America, isn't it?
Yeah.
I love that. Or really, it came from South America as well. So I love those, like when you just look a little bit deeper at something, you'll see interconnection everywhere, I think.
Yes, especially with food and migration patterns of food. Vikram, I wanted to talk about something in regards to that isolation, the sense of like the fact that the South Asian community is not particularly big in Norway. Do you feel like that had a certain effect on you growing up and the person you would want to become later? Or?
Well, I guess the thing is also the fact that, my mother she's East African Indian, so she's born in Kenya. And she studied in the UK, like, I mean, she was born while Kenya was still a colony, right? So her first passport was a colonial subject passport. And like many people who belong to kind of the middle or upper middle classes, they sent their children to the UK to study. So she studied there, and then she was kind of sort of quite an adventurous person. So she wanted to just see what Norway was like, and then she came here. And she met my dad, who is Norwegian. So, I mean, there weren't many people of any other ethnicity in Norway at that time in the 70s, But then there were some Pakistanis started coming, and they were doing more what would you say? Like, they weren't like, it wasn't academic labor, right? So, I mean, it wasn't like, I don't know. I don't think she would have connected much to the South Indian community here, at the time. But then it was also the fact that she married like a white Christian guy. So there was also that. But she had some Indian origin friends, like, one of her best friends was a Parsi woman. So like there was like, we had some kind of Indian family friends around, but not many. Yeah, and I grew up in a very, very white dominated sort of place where, references to India, like, I write about this in one of my short stories, Growing Up Queer, like how at school people would be like, oh, so you probably eat like monkey brain, and, it was like the Indiana Jones film that wasn't even from India, kind of that reference, yeah. So it was quite ignorant and homogenous, to put it that way.
Yeah, it's a very toxic environment to grow up in, which both me and Ishita can very much relate to, since we also had to deal with similar problems growing up, but in a different country. Andre,
can I just say, Vikram, like that story was just so moving when I read it. I mean, I've only skimmed the surface of your collection, Lord of the Senses, but I felt like that was it just opened my eyes into another perspective, particularly, I mean, coming from a country where brown bodies are not unusual. I didn't even realize I was brown until I, went away, and suddenly it's like, oh wait, yeah,
That's brown privilege.
Yeah.
We got brown privilege. Damn,
Yeah.
I was all that.
But one thing I'll say is, yes, Lord of the Senses, I think, is a really interesting study in globalization and the way globalism can also affect the way that we write. And I want to get to that later because that's another part of our conversation. But I think that that is a very key difference that I want to bring out, Andre, just now, is that there's a difference. Like people like me or Vikram or Ishita grew up in like areas where to be white or Western in a certain way is the norm, and then to be a South Asian person is abnormal or the deviant kind of way of understanding the world. Whereas in your case, you might have grown up in a place that was more just brown and black, and then that creates a different formation. So would you like to talk a little bit about how Indianness plays a role in the way that you would have formed yourself growing up?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. I was having a conversation recently with some of my friends about this, and Trinidad is truly, I feel, unlike anywhere else because we are incredibly, incredibly cosmopolitan. The idea that human beings can be complex and can have multiple identities and genealogies and come from all over, that's something that we've long grown accustomed to. I mean, yes, we still have tensions, and there's a lot of, especially in our politics, there's a lot of racism and very subtle forms of othering that occurs. But because we have so many different groups here, we have been forced to kind of like figure it out and like exist together. And if it's one thing I feel Trinidad does very well and better than many, many developed countries, it is diversity. Like we have it down. We have every single holiday on our calendar is like dedicated to a different different ethnic group. We have East Indian Arrival Day, we have Emancipation Day, we even have a day for the First Peoples. And we were just talking about food, and we share each other's culture. Like Christians will celebrate Diwali to an extent, and Hindus will celebrate Christian to an extent, and there's this very fecund overlap between things. And I think growing up, I think someone once said race is an invention, and I think I kind of understand that from my own experience growing up, because you're kind of unaware of race until something happens in life that points out like the difference, Vikram, as you write about. And I think growing up with me, I wasn't really too attuned to the differences until I began to notice family dynamics. Because when you're in a mixed family, you have your mom's side of the family and your dad's side of the family, and then like they would get together and you'd notice things. And I mean, I didn't notice there were some very clear markers of differences. And to some extent, I did feel like people who come from so many different mixed people in Trinidad are sometimes able to fit into all different pockets. At the same time, there is that sense of separation where you're not quite Indian enough, you're not quite Black enough wherever you go. And I think that's one thing we all have in common. And so there is that. But alongside that, there's a wider social picture that is a bit more optimistic, a bit more hopeful, I think. And so I think growing up, that did shape me in the sense that I was at once separate from everything, as well as involved in everything. So there was this strange kind of antinomy going on where you feel a kind of universal acceptance, but at the same time, you also feel a kind of universal pushback. So I think that kind of like was perfect for my position as a poet and a writer, because I think that's what writers do. We have to somehow be able to have that degree of, I wouldn't say impartiality, but we we are able to step outside and empathize with all different perspectives. And to do that, you really have to be able to, to step away, So I think that really informed a lot of what I do now.
That's really neat. Yeah, I know that's so different from the dynamics we get in, other places that are more white dominated. So it's so fascinating to hear that. When did you kind of realize that you wanted to write from that place of sort of almost tension, I guess, where you're like looking at your multiple identities and looking at this kind of place in between where you're everywhere but you're nowhere?
So, okay, so I have this story. So I studied in London, and it was interesting living in London for a few years. And there was this incident where I used to use a swimming pool. I think it was a public swimming pool or something. I can't remember. And I was swimming in the pool, and another swimmer just literally stopped me and asked me, "Excuse me, I'm sorry, are you a coolie?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." So this was a very strange kind of moment, because on the one hand, I'd heard obviously the word coolie. It's now been reappropriated in a very empowering way. There are books called Coolie Woman and stuff like that, but it was largely a derogatory word from where I was coming from, in Trinidad and in anywhere in the British former British Empire. And I couldn't quite figure out in what sense this person was this person just genuinely curious as to where I was from, or was he using this in a like in derogatory way? Or it was just too complicated to figure out the dynamic. And also I was in the middle of a swimming pool swimming, so why a conversation is not ideal. So I think events like that, like going away and recognizing, I mean, in Trinidad, as I said, there would be tensions and stuff every now and again, but going away, going into a white space, it did become markedly different, because on the one hand, I am queer, and I had left Trinidad, which to a large extent, I think, to some extent people perceive it as a homophobic space, although that is changing. And indeed, there are many queer elements indigenous in our culture. But I was part of that trajectory where the idea of, well, if you are gay, you have to leave your country and go to a developed country where you have a better chance of happiness. I was kind of along that axis for a while, and then here I am going to London only to discover that I was Black. So and there was a new marker in which I was different. So I was kind of oh, this is very complicated, and it kind of forced a reckoning with myself. I wouldn't say that I consciously decided that I would write from that perspective, but I think that perspective, it was more of an organic kind of thing that happened. And I think it happens with every writer. We can't help but be political to an extent in what we're doing, even when we're not aiming to be political. That itself is a political position, as George Orwell said. And so I think it was really around that stage, but I guess, and then identity is so complex. I think it really is like being at the seashore. It's like a wave that's building and retreating, then coming back. And because I could ask that same question about, well, when did I begin to infuse my writing with my race? I could ask the same question in relation to my sexuality, because then, when did my queerness begin to have an impact on my writing? And it's so funny because I was always interested in poetry, and I was always interested in fiction and short fiction and writing, but it really took off when in my teenage years, when I started to have crushes on guys. So I would write poems for them in school, and I would make little chapbooks and give it to them, sometimes anonymously. So there's some embarrassing juvenilia by me out there. But and that was another way in which, that was a strange kind of way, not strange, but that was a way in which my sexuality had a direct input into my writing, So, and that came first. So it's so interesting, though.
Sorry, my microphone was on mute.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was like, why am I muted? Yeah, I think that someday you should collect your juvenilia of like writing.
Oh no.
Publish it all.
We want to
Oh,
read it.
You.
We will read
oh
it. Don't
goodness.
worry. We will try to get it reviewed in the Paris review if we can. Don't worry.
Cringe poetry from my youth. The next chapter.
Um,
Vikram, what about you? I mean, it's completely different for you, I know, since you're, growing up in that white dominated space in a completely different way. But what was it like for you when you were trying to kind of find your identity and find your voice as a writer? And how did your ethnicity play into that?
Well, just as you asked that question, I remember kind of a short story I wrote when I was, I don't know, a child, early teens, or even before that, I think probably, when I was struggling with, how to identify or what I was. I felt like I was really in between. And that was a short story, which was kind of a bit harsh on white people. And my dad, who's a white man, poor guy, he kind of printed it from his printer at work, and he came back to give it to me. And I think, I can't remember exactly what he said, but I just remember him it was kind of like a sad moment, I feel. But it's like, yeah, that's the first, like, that's an idea or a memory that just came to me as you asked that question. I think like writing for me is really a way of expressing and exploring, myself and the world that I experience. So ever since I was very young, I would read, different kinds of books, but yeah, a lot of books from Indian authors or Indian origin authors to kind of, that was my somewhat like connection to India, I guess, as well. And my mother's family, who live in the UK, in Leicester, where there's a very large Indian community, they would always supply me with, books, and they knew that I was also very interested in Indian spirituality, so they would supply me with, books on that. So I think I was interested in these things ever since I was, really, really small, I think, in trying to find my way in the world, and literature was a way of traveling and connecting to something else as well, which wasn't that readily available in Norway, I guess.
Yes, I mean, I can relate as well to having to use like India itself as a supplement, kind of, to finding those ways to make sense and harmony out of those things that were not present in your actual physical environment. I think we should talk a little bit about queerness for a bit, because all four of us happen to be LGBT, and I think it's something that we can talk about, maybe to a certain extent. Are there ways that you feel like queerness and race, beyond like, say, what Andre talked about, like, do you feel like there are ways that your queerness, your race allowed you to position yourself in ways that allowed you to become the writer that you are? Or do you think that it helped form your mentality in a certain way that kind of would have made you, like, if you weren't this type of writer of different races, nationalities, sexual preferences, would you have chosen to write in another way?
Well, I think everything that I am influences me, and all my experiences influence me. I think what Andre said, that resonates with me, that, the queerness, and also for me, my ethnic and cultural background, because it is a real minority in Norway, that has always, sometimes put me on the outside, but sometimes also just given me a little bit of that outsider perspective on things, I think. And maybe, yeah, I think it's, I also related quite a lot to spirituality, actually, because it's a sense of not just taking things for granted, but actually wanting to question and look deeply at something. It's not, you're not just like accepted as who you are, which means that, oh, who am I, and what is this life, and what is this world, and those sort of quite big questions. I think that is definitely that's maybe part of my queer and ethnic minority heritage. I think also the outsider position has kind of given me, a real impulse for social justice, and a lot of what I write will also be colored by that. You know, it's yeah. So queerness for me, you know, is also like questioning certain dominant structures in societies like Norway and India when it comes to like class and caste and all kinds of other things as well. I'm interested in, not just LGBT in a kind of narrow sense. Yeah, so like, you know, like Lord of the Senses, the title story of Lord of the Senses is about Mirabai's love for Krishna, which for me is a real queer love, because she's completely defying norms for sexuality and gender at that time, you know, like dancing with Muslims and people of all castes and classes, and not like you know, breaking up from a husband, and having this like mad love for Krishna. So these things definitely like intersect in my life, and I think sort of enrich each other somehow. Yeah.
Yes, I can really relate to what you say as well, and that being discriminated against and denied so much in your early childhood years made you extremely existential and really like interested kind of in what are the deeper questions of self, because I think I have that same tendency, as Ishita knows. Andre, yes.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I mean, it's so interesting. Again, this is an interesting dichotomy, because on the one hand, you know, you're writing and you're fulfilling the requirements of the work. It's really the work that's really dictating what you're going to really, what's going to happen. And sometimes you write with no set notions, with no preconceptions, and you're actually exploring and discovering something as you write. And there's a whole you know, debate over, well, there are some poets, for instance, who would say, you know, their poetry is not political, it's not confessional, it has nothing to do with their personal life. They are putting on a persona in the poem. And then there are others who readily embrace the fact that, yeah, this is my life that I'm writing about. And I think we should be free to really move along that spectrum. And I think inevitably, though, no matter what position is adopted, there is a process of personal, the inflective position does become exflective, and it does become something that tells us about who you are as a person. And I think with regard to queerness, there's such a, and I know the word queer is a word that some people are still not comfortable with, but I think though it's such a great catch-all for a word, because there is a spectrum of expression and ways in which we can be queer. And I remember, you know, I've always been out, although we all know, you know, as a gay person, you're constantly coming out. There's always people you have to, it's constantly happening. But I was always like that, and I was never really ashamed or afraid. But I just didn't think that, well, it's not every day I want to talk about, you know, penis or sex. So, you know, I don't have to really spell it out definitely in every single thing I do. I'm not following a program, or, you know, I'm not, you know, my audience is not stupid. And I remember though that I felt sometimes that there was a feeling that because I wasn't doing that, that there's some sort of disguise or hiding. And there was and that may well be true to an extent, but it was also a way of dismissing what I was doing as, well, this is not real, this is not true, as opposed to it being an aesthetic choice, or as opposed to choices that were dictated by the work that I was doing, as opposed to a serious engagement with what I was doing, you know, because I remember being steeped in poets like John Ashbery and entire schools of, you know, poetic tradition that are not necessarily, that are more about being playful, you know, that are more like the poem as drag. Each poem is a different carnival costume. And but then of course, as I change and as things in the world changed, you know, I began to appreciate more and more the importance of visibility, because, you know, as we've just seen in the last 4 years, we think we've made a lot of progress, and maybe we have to some extent internationally, but there's so much more that we have to do, and visibility is a huge part of it. So in that sense, that became like something I was mindful of and began to think about, but not from a place of, well, I'm going to have to systematically do something and follow a specific program. I just go and I explore wherever my heart takes me, you know, in the writing. but I wanted to come back to race for 1 second, because when we were talking about specific moments when I was thinking about what role my culture, my lineage could play, and one moment was also when Derek Walcott had his Nobel lecture. The famous St. Lucian poet who also has deep ties to Trinidad, and we do claim him as one of our own. And
I claim him as one of mine.
Exactly. His Nobel lecture is this beautiful description of Ram Leela in Felicity here in Trinidad, the festival that takes place, which is like outdoor theater, I guess. But and when I read that, he so beautifully described it, and he talks a lot in that lecture about always wanting to fulfill the potential of using the resources, the multicultural resources that were around it, and to bring that in the into the poetry and in the writing. And I was just like, wow. I was just like, yeah. I began to think of all of these differences, or all of these ways that I might otherwise be othered, pun intended, as not a liability, but actually a resource to draw on. Because then I think at the end of the day, it's all about truth. It's all about writing something that's true. Yes, there's all this politics, and yes, there's all of these, feelings and expressions and whatever. But if you do something that's true and that can encourage empathy, I think that's what matters. So then I realized that process of drilling down to the truth involved a kind of embracing all of these different costumes that I have to wear.
It's really neat. Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of different hats involved with being, queer, multi-ethnic, all of those things. So I want to ask, now that you've got the conversation kind of on all of these different things you want to wear, what are your goals for pushing that narrative forward in terms of your identity as a biracial person, as a queer person, as a man, as expat, immigrant, whatever you want to call yourself, where you are? What are your goals in pushing those narratives forward in your respective country?
No, maybe we'll ask Vikram to take it, because Andre's spoken quite well for the last few
Either
minutes.
one, both of you.
I mean,
Okay,
I think.
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Or maybe, yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Vikram.
Or Andre, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead, Vikram.
I'm still a bit holding my breath after your beautiful talk. Like, really, I was like, oh, so beautiful. I was really touched by that. I was. Different costumes and Derek Walcott, and just, yeah, truth, empathy, love it.
Oh, thank you. Gosh.
Yeah.
Um,
So how am I trying to push? I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fully got the question, Ishita.
I think what Ishita was trying to say is, and I think I'll try to modify the question a little bit, is being a person who has so many different aspects of yourself and who belong to so many different categories. Are you interested in, say in the context of, in your case, Norwegian literature, are there certain things that you would want to create that you feel are lacking in your national canon? Or even, I was going to ask afterwards, I think I might as well ask it now since it comes now more organically. Are you even interested in those questions? Are you maybe also just interested in writing because you have so many things? Maybe it's like, fuck that. I mean, why not create a new canon that belongs to the global world and belongs to all these things colliding at once, So
yeah, I think maybe to some extent for me it's been, kind of like when I was younger, I connected to India through literature, and I've also, taken somewhat part, at least, in the queer LGBTQ mobilization in India, and I've done that through, participation in also literary magazines in India, queer literary magazines. So some of my writing, actually a lot of the short stories in Lord of the Senses was published in some version in India in a queer magazine, for example. So I've been I guess I've been communicating with like queer people in India to some extent through my writing, and that's been some of my project, I guess. But then I've also, together with a friend of mine, a white friend, we've established this micro publisher called Mohini Books in Norway. Well, we're, both of us are based in Norway, but it's that's a queer, we are both queer, and we kind of I guess we view it as a queer micro publisher, and it's called Mohini Books after kind of the inspiration from the myth of Mohini. So playfulness of genders and sexualities, and not necessarily a connection to South Asia and India, but yeah. So I mean, we do have that, and an anthology with different texts, including one by you, Kiran, poem, was published in celebration of the decriminalization of homosexuality in India. And that book, is also available in Norway. Then, it's sold in a local bookshop just up here on the corner, which is really nice. Because I don't think those sorts of books, and I think Norway is progressing, but I can count on like one finger, I think, the amount of brown editors and publishers that exist here. So and white people will always want the narrative to be of a certain kind, I think, still. So it's not the same. Yeah, and I've also published, with Norwegian publishers. So it's not that, and I think I'm also clearly queer, and also drawing on my Indian heritage in that book. So yeah. And the Norwegian, I mean, if in one way I relate to Norway as a country and a literary kind of culture, etc. And there are a lot of Norwegian authors I have a lot of respect for, really, I love. And the Norwegian literary kind of landscape is definitely changing as well. There are more authors of various backgrounds, to put it that way. So that's great, but I don't see myself as, I don't know, it's interesting. I don't want to be like one of the minority ethnic writers of Norway. That's not my position to be in. It's maybe what you were saying, Kiran. I feel more like I want to be global in a way, Yes. I can communicate with the queer community in India. We can like, the Lord of the Senses was published by a queer of color centric press in London, the UK. So I'm very, very happy that there's also a global community that I can be part of.
I agree with you. I want to now modify my question a little bit because now another question inside of the more abstract question has come out, and then I'm going to turn to Andre. Given, however, your formation in Norway, do you feel that there are certain things that you wish Norway had, or you wish that something of the culture production of Norway or the space of Norway was changed to allow people like yourself to exist more? Do you think that there's something that could be spoken to in that regard?
It's so interesting, Kiran, because as I'm talking and as you ask me that question as well, I feel a little bit irritation and I'm provoked. And I think that is about the fact that there hasn't been this space in Norway, like when Andre was talking about Trinidad and Tobago and the kind of the diversity and the appreciation of diversity there, like I had goosebumps. That is not Norway. And then immediately I feel a little bit guilty, because I'm like, just like Trinidad and Tobago gets like all this like praise now, and Norway sounds like such a horrible place, and it really isn't. It really isn't. I mean, I love Norway for its nature. I love Norwegian culture for the connection to nature. There are a lot of good things about Norwegian culture in Norway, but it has been an incredibly homogenous country. And, whatever diversity that's been here, like the Sami people or the Romani, the travelers, that's kind of just been like, boom, you do not speak your language. You settle down like ordinary good Christian Norwegian folks. And, you act like a proper Norwegian. It's been a complete assimilation. So now things are changing, and they're changing very rapidly. So I'm glad, but I wonder if that's for the generation, not my generation. I'm a bit like, you know what, I'm 40, you guys deal with this now. So, and I'm glad that the younger generation is. I think there's
Oh, come on. Come on, look at you.
I've got some gray. I've got some gray as well, Andre.
I have more grace than you.
Yeah, I know. He's the oldest and the best looking out of the four of us. You're not.
Oh,
You know,
Kiran,
I don't
stop talking. Your team baby.
baby face, but in other places too, we could say. But anyways.
I definitely think we have no choice but to be part of a global conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, that is inherently, it's inevitable. But what I'm thinking of, Toni Morrison once said, write the book that you want to read. And I think the book that I want to read is a book that only I could have written, and you write what you know. And I have a lot of resources to draw upon here in Trinidad. A lot of, so many books have come before, and Caribbean literature is so rich with so many different forms of writing. But I think that's one thing I would like to push going forward, like that notion of, well, the story is always changing. It is not as though there's a monolithic, identity is not just one fixed thing, and just because somebody has written this in the past doesn't mean that that's how it is now. There's always a clapback or a response or a change or something that has happened, that I think that's the job of the writer, to always be on the pulse of, to some extent. And then there's the fact that, well, Margaret Atwood has a wonderful essay about Kafka, where the whole essay is her talking about a previous essay that she had written about Kafka when she was a teenager, and she's just dissecting it, and it's brilliant. And I do pay homage to it in my book. But in that essay, she says, while she was writing about Kafka, the real subject of my essay was me. I just thought that was so profound, because in whatever exploration happens, whatever global ties, whatever global linkages we seek to forge, it all relates back to a personal sense of self and identity. And again, like that issue of coming closer to truth. So I think, yeah, definitely that's something I would like to push and to see. But it's also something I think that we have no choice at this stage, to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me, like as someone who's reflecting on those notions of truth, but also in the the permeabilities of nation, race, and culture, which is something I'm really exactly exploring right now. That you can change a lot of these superficial labels, but those core truth values. I was thinking that we often say that and there's this kind of shunning of the term universal now. And I was just thinking last night is maybe rather than saying that we as authors are trying to replicate the universal, we're trying to replicate the eternal, and that is this kind of this hologram, this kind of base kind of existence that we are just trying to replicate and rewrite and reimagine every few hundred years. And it changes race, it changes nationality, it changes shape, but there's something that we as a species are trying to replicate and recreate. And then we read stories that create that and recreate it properly and successfully, and we return to them time and time again, even if all the other trajectories of that story have changed, So I was thinking maybe it is the eternal that we seek in literature, and that maybe now we're in a space where that we just no longer want to write with these labels, Norway, US, Trinidad, South Asian, whatever. We're trying to just go directly to the eternal now in a way, and trying to play with that in consciousness, I think, is interesting.
And also, one of the great lessons that I think writing has taught me is that the specific is actually universal. Like our particular experiences, within that, there resonates something that everyone can understand. So it's a very interesting antinomy there happening.
Yeah, and I feel when I write from like Lord of the Senses, it's clearly queer, and it's also clearly kind of related to some notion of Indian culture or Indian heritage, and I don't over explain stuff. I do want anybody to read it. I hope that anybody would read it, a straight white person, whoever. I want anybody to read this book and hopefully to get something out of it, but I'm not going to be like overly accommodating to explain every little thing, because that's kind of been the thing. What has been the norm, at least in Norway and the West, has been that there is a white straight person, and that's just taken for granted. Unless it says brown, we know that the character and the person is white and straight. And I think I've read a lot of books like that where, you know, it's particular to the straight white experience, but I can definitely empathize. You know, it's not that goddamn difficult. But the thing is, you know, as queer people and as minority ethnic people, we have that double consciousness. You know, we, from when we were very, very young, we've learned to view things like that. I think for, you know, like a white audience, it's different. Like if a book isn't written for a white audience about India or about whatever other culture, then it's like it takes a tiny bit of work to actually figure out, oh, what does this word mean? Well, Google it, you know?
Yeah, but I also
that's still I think universal, or it's because back to the thing about particular and universal. I think, you know, I definitely everything is located somewhere, and we're, you know, we are of this specific place, and at the same time, you know, this is the earth, and we all breathe air, and we have a heart, and we long, and we love, and all of that. But the particular forms, I think, will differ, and the different forms, I enjoy that. I want us to celebrate the differences as well, you know. So to me, it's like I like to read different kinds of literature, and I'm not lazy. I will look up words. I will try to figure things out, or just not understand, but not complain about not understanding, you know?
Yeah, and I think another point to that is that when you write stuff that and over explain it in a way, you're doing a disservice to the reader. You're automatically assuming that the reader is too dumb, too lazy, too whatever, and you're not letting them grow as a reader and do the work.
Mm. Yeah, and to me, it's also an aesthetic thing, right? It breaks completely with the sense that if a short story is set in India, you just don't explain words like, I don't know what, like cha-cha or whatever, like you don't explain jira or something, you know? It's just, it would be just a very weird break with the whole aesthetic of a story as well. So I find that really, really strange. But there is a whole genre, I think, of literature which is aimed at the dominant white audience, where all these things are kind of explained as well, and that's fine. But I think white people can look up words as well and try to, you know, put themselves in a different kind of context.
Yeah, and while we're talking about globalism and stuff, in a way, we need to start decentering white as the default reader.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, something that is, interestingly enough, when we often say the word quote unquote universal, we're assuming a certain visage, a certain narrative and its arrow that assumes that this is the norm and this is how the narrative is constructed. But in reality, there's so many different ways that narrative can take place and be shaped, and people as well identify as and belong. So I think that decentralization is also very much a part of it. I mean, this is a very interesting book I'm reading right now called Sand Talk. I don't know if some of you have heard of it. It's by an Aboriginal Australian who's trying to re-inhabit Aboriginal Australian culture and project it globally, which I think is really interesting. And that's also a tendency right now in Australian Aboriginal literature to now kind of decenter and recontextualize globalism in the Aboriginal Australian context, which I think is a really cool project. So I think there are different ways that South Asian culture, Aboriginal culture, Caribbean culture can kind of decentralize the globe and reorbit it, which I think is really exciting.
I think definitely in the Caribbean, we've had to grapple with this idea of having to translate our culture to fit whatever gaze, you know, whatever audience is being served. And I think it's a question of audience. But the internet has changed a lot of these things. You know, now people have a greater awareness of other countries, I hope, or to some extent. And yeah, as Vikram said, someone can just, like, if you want to find out what the word means, just Google it, you know, and it will come up. But it does have a lot to do with, especially when there are little notes sometimes you see in a book explaining a Caribbean word. Like, I guess there might be one for Jira. Who knows if I were to write that? I mean, it does kind of perpetuate the hegemony of what is the overriding current mainstream kind of system within which that literature is being.
But I also didn't necessarily like, for example, certain words like cha-cha, chachi would not be known to a Kannadiga or Tamil speaker as well, even though they're both live in India. So I don't think we need to necessarily like stigmatize people who want to do that research and learn about things. I think rather it's more that we need to make sure that if someone chooses to write a story with words in Tamil, words in Bhojpuri, they should not feel guilty for choosing to write in that language, or if they are making references to things. It's like, you can just try to, even if you don't understand it, you can learn to understand it in another way.
That's a huge issue in the Caribbean when it comes to things like dialogue. Do you use Caribbean dialogue, or do you try and, and then do you translate, and how do you handle that? That's something we've grappled with for a while. And, we reached a stage where writers in the Caribbean today don't have to worry about that. I think, like, we just write whatever we want to write. And it just, all of this reminds me of something Brandon Taylor recently said about his novel, Real Life. He said he wanted to just write a novel, not for the white, straight male gaze, but just for himself, for gay people alone to read. And I just thought, oh, that's actually an interesting and empowering idea, because yes, it's all about forging links and being empathetic, but also realizing that, you don't have to necessarily kowtow to some other oppressive system. You can actually just be whoever you want to be and just go forward,
Mm-hmm. We've actually got a great audience question that kind of pertains to this conversation that I wanted to bring in. Roy Wadia asks, given the jingoism and populism that we see in so many countries and regions, South Asia included, we're also seeing our communities divided or otherwise affected. How can we address this challenge, given that we, often as the disenfranchised or discriminated against people communities, have perhaps a greater responsibility to break those barriers? How do we bring about that empathy and reconciliation coming from the disenfranchised perspective?
Oh, I love that question. I would like to answer. Because I think, though, we in particular don't have a particular responsibility. This is a responsibility everybody has. And I think it starts with, there are two directions, two ways it happens. I think it should be addressed. It starts with the top down, and it starts from the bottom up. And I think it starts with leadership. And the problem that I've seen repeatedly all over the world is leadership has been failing to address all of these issues. People have been doing things very cynically, or just to fulfill legal requirements, or just to be politically correct. And there's not been a real emphasis on real change, on actually embracing difference and diversity because you actually want to, or you actually know that, well, this is the way the world is complex. Instead, there's been a strange kind of dogged insistence on maintaining the way things are. And at times, outwardly, things might seem to change, and there might be tokenistic advances that happen. But when that is removed, you realize, oh, it's still the same. And I think we've just seen the last 4 years, that is what, has been going on. All of these things that we thought we'd made progress on, they're still here, they're still biting us. The other side, though, is from the ground up. And I think what we can do is, we were just talking about particularities and universalities. I think what's important is empathy. The poet Roger Robinson, Trinidadian poet, says poems are empathy machines. I think it's really important for people to recognize the humanity in other people, to respect that, and to try and get everyone to understand each other's position. And that is what storytelling is all about. That is what art does better than so many other things. And if we have that focus, because I think sometimes we lose sight of the human. We lose sight of the human element, to use that phrase. And we are so caught up in our divisiveness, as the question put it, and we're so caught up in our own strident politics, we kind of risk alienating not only people from across the divide, but people within our own communities sometimes. And we don't actually think in terms of how do we foster compassion? How do you foster understanding? How do you create bonds, the bonds and the emotional linkages that are needed for people to actually, love one another, which is what it's all about. Part of me is very pessimistic sometimes. I think, sometimes I'm like, you can't teach people to be decent. We can't, we can't legislate. We can't affirmative action. What can we do to get people to just be like, oh yeah, you are equal to me? Like, I mean, I mean, how, but at the same time, there is a value in just, well, maybe we have no choice but to try, and so I think these are the two ways it should happen. It should happen from the top down, and it should happen, from the ground up, where people also make leaders accountable for not fulfilling, the true potential that we have as a people globally.
Can I follow up on that? Yeah, so I really appreciate what you're saying, Andre, and I think I also have a background as a human rights lawyer, and there is a human rights philosopher, scholar called Richard Rorty, or legal scholar, who writes about the importance of storytelling. He says that when human rights violations were happening on the Balkans or wherever else, it wasn't because some people thought that, oh, the people on the other side, they don't have human rights. They thought those people over there, they're not really human. They're not as human as we are. So, I mean, that's, I think, always the case. It's a case of dehumanization. And we know this with the kind of words that are used, like cockroaches or whatever else, like floods of refugees, etc. And I think the stories are, I'm not like, I don't think I'm overly romantic and hopeful when it comes to this, but I do think stories matter. And I don't think they need to be of high literary quality either. I think stories generally matter. Somebody who has, had a hard breakup and they're upset. Who hasn't experienced that? Somebody whose relative is getting older and they're afraid that that person's going to die. Who's not going to experience that? I mean, the stories of, containing some of the universal, but in a particular way, I think that is a real important thing when it comes to empathy. And then I was wondering if I could read a short thing from my latest book, which has to do with loving. And it's a little bit, I'll say something about it. So it's Becoming Buddha. I love like Buddha loves. I start with myself. I put a hand on my heart and wish myself well. Vikram. I remember Bhat, her smile and tone of voice when she said my name. May you be happy, Vikram. I repeated gently a few times. Then I imagined my best friend. May you be happy, Martin. In my mind, Martin is already laughing and I smile. Then I imagine the woman who works in the shop nearby. I don't know her name. She has dark, short hair. Her daughter is a hairdresser and does her hair sometimes. She's mentioned that. I imagine her smiling while having her hair cut by her daughter. May you be happy. Then I imagine someone who is more difficult for me to love. A politician who seems to dislike people like me. I think of her full name. I see her in a debate, critical of immigrants. I tense up. Then I remind myself that she too suffers and wants to be happy. I whisper her given name and wish her well. May you too be happy. Then I imagine the whole blue planet as seen from the space. May we all be happy. And for me, it is about that. When I think about this, this one politician, right-wing politician, I can tense up. I can feel that. Like we can all get into a divisive mood because, we feel that there's this whole dynamic. It's not difficult to get into a divisive mood and start othering people. I do that all the time. I do that with my white partner. And it's a very human thing to do, I think. So we have that in common as well, actually, paradoxically, that we other each other. But then, is it possible for me to remind myself and do some work, starting here, like thinking about this, right-wing politician, you know what? Her first name, Siv, it's not that bad. That's what her mother called her when she was a tiny baby, thinking about that name and knowing that, okay, she suffers as well. She wants to be happy. I can wish her well. And then sadly, we all get stuck in various views that are oppressive sometimes, but yeah. Okay, so that was,
that was me. Very valid point. Do we have any other questions, Ishita, in the chat box?
No, and I think we're just about
out of time
actually.
as well. So do you have any last words?
That's
Well,
Yes, I guess not.
famous last words. Last words. So I hope not. But I mean, I would just say, thank you so much for having me as part of this conversation.
Wonderful.
And I'm really glad that there are so many resonances with what we've been talking about here, and with what Vikram's been writing, and in my own book as well. And I think my book is a cornucopia of culture, but it's also a love letter to Trinidad and to my people. And I say my people wherever they may be all over the world. And I really hope that conversations like this continue. And, who knows where we might end up. One day we might really fulfill our potential as a race, I guess. Wow, this has become very lofty. I'm going to stop talking now. Okay. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
I love lofty, and I'm really happy to have met you here, Andre. And thank you to Kiran and Ishita as well for having me. Yeah, and I hope I think I've been a bit angry, and I'm not going to apologize. I have been a bit angry. That was part of it, but I've also felt love and goosebumps and everything else. So thank you.
I mean, yes. I mean, I want to make sure, Vikram, that even if you felt like I was trying to push you on certain things, I think that was also something that.
No. I think when I felt angry, it was because I was reminded of something that I have really missed, or I've just not expected to feel in Norway. So that is the anger. It's
something that I relate to. I mean, I've had to deal with a similar problem, which is why we're trying to create spaces like this where people like us who relate on a certain key issue but are otherwise thrown across all the other parts of the world can connect and talk to each other. So
a really big reason that Kiran and I created this space is, in a lot of ways, we wanted to bring our own Indian community out.
Yeah.
We were missing our Indian community for ourselves. So having this space where we can connect with the members of the diaspora all over the world, it makes us feel more in tune.
I love that.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys for sharing your incredible, valuable perspectives and showing a new side of the diaspora. And we just really appreciate you coming on and working us into your schedules.
Oh, thank you for having us. And it's been wonderful to meet you, Vikram, as well, and Ishita, everyone. It's been really wonderful.
So everyone else at Sambhashana who's watching on the other side, we're super happy that you came and watched us. And
thank you to all of our viewers.
Yes, and on April 7th, I believe, we're going to be talking to Preetha Samasaran and Deepak Unnikrishnan from the UAE and Malaysia, respectively, on what it means to be sojourning authors who travel and write fiction from that perspective. So please join us if you can.
Yes. Andre, Vikram, where can people find you on the internet if they want to follow more along with your work? Do you have Facebook pages?
Yeah, so my website is vikram.no, NO for Norway. So I do claim that connection. And find me on Facebook, Vikram Kolmannskog. On Instagram, it's Vikram Writes. Glad to connect with people.
And I am andrebagoo.com, and I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just searchable under Andre Bagoo.
All right. And I want to make one last note before we head out for the afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you guys are. In light of this entire conversation of connecting and finding each other and not othering one another, Kiran and I are both originally from Atlanta, and I'm sure everyone's heard about kind of the horrific stuff going on there this week. We have a couple posts down below here where we've listed out some resources for Asian American and Pacific Islander organizations across the country. And you can look there to help and see where you can, donate time, resources, volunteer, whatever it is that you feel called to do in terms of supporting the Asian American community in Atlanta right now. So we thank you for that. And we thank you for coming here, keeping your minds open, and joining us on this kind of all over the place, lofty journey exploring a lot of different parts of identity. So, all right, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are, and we will catch you on our next episode.
Bye.
Bye-bye.